Hello again and welcome back. This is Module 2 of our PMP Scrum Practice Guide. In this module, I'm going to cover what I've called the Scrum Essentials, building on the overview that I gave you in Module 1. So let's make a start right away. There's something called the 3 pillars of Scrum, which is important for you to understand as it's the bedrock upon which Scrum is built. And the first of these is called transparency. And what transparency is all about, basically, is to ensure that there's a common understanding by all involved. And this covers aspects such as standards, definitions, and certainly language, particularly jargon or the naming of processes or products. And it's absolutely vital that significant aspects of the Scrum process must be visible to those responsible for the outcome. In other words, transparency means that the whole team has the same picture and knowledge of what exactly is going on. The second of the 3 pillars is called inspection, and this is about the whole team, including the users and customers, must frequently inspect Scrum artifacts, as you learnt in the last module, and progress towards what's known as a sprint goal to detect undesirable variances. We'll learn more about the sprint goal as I go into more detail about the sprints themselves. So transparency is that everyone has a common understanding of the current state of the project, and inspection is where we constantly check the artifacts and project progress towards the sprint goal to make sure we are still on track, if you will. But you may have heard quite rightly that Scrum is lightweight, but as I said in Module 1, it's agile by its very nature, completely the opposite to more traditional predictive or waterfall approaches to the management of projects. So in order to keep Scrum nimble, if you will, there's a couple of riders. First, that any inspections on Scrum artifacts and so on should not be so frequent that it gets in the way of the team doing the work. Fairly obvious, but it needs to be said. And second is that you should ensure that such inspections diligently carried out by skilled inspectors at the point of work. Otherwise, they will not be beneficial. And the third pillar of Scrum is adaptation. Now, if an inspector, I'm using a very general word here, this could be one of the roles or a relevant stakeholder, determines that one or more aspects of a process deviate outside acceptable limits, I'll explain what that means later, and that the resulting product will be unacceptable, then in any of those situations, the process or the material itself being processed must be adjusted in some way. And this adjustment must be made as soon as possible to minimize further deviation. So these 3 main pillars of Scrum weave continuously throughout the whole of the framework. Okay, so how exactly does adaptation work? Well, Scrum describes 4 formal events, which we've already touched on at least. The first is sprint planning, and here we'll learn about something called grooming the backlog. More of that later. Then the daily scrum, which is reviewing the progress of the sprint itself, and if there are any problems, what can be done to resolve them. Then you've got the sprint review, which is reviewing the product, whatever state it's in, maybe just a beta release of something, and getting excellent feedback from the users themselves. And then you have the sprint retrospective, which checks how the sprint itself was carried out, in other words, the process, and how we can improve that process for the upcoming sprint and future sprints. So what is a sprint? You've got a fairly good idea already. It contains and consists, as I've said above, sprint planning, daily scrums, the development work by the specialist team, the sprint review and the sprint retrospective. However, what's more interesting here is what goes on during the sprint. Well, as the sprint proceeds and the products are created, scope may be clarified and negotiated between the product owner and the development team as more is learned. In a later module, when we look in more detail at these roles, you'll find that the product owner represents the customer and users. Again, going back to another pillar of Scrum, and that's transparency. But care needs to be taken to ensure that quality goals do not decrease. Those are the acceptance criteria, if you will, of each of the products being created. And just as important, that no changes are made that would endanger the sprint goal. Now, I haven't talked much about the sprint goal yet, but in essence, it does what it says. It's the objective or outcome you expect from that current sprint. So, on the one hand, we're making sure that that's protected so that once the sprint starts, the sprint goal does not change. However, one of the pillars is adaptation, So there's a balance to be made here between adapting what we're doing, making sure that quality goals do not decrease, and that the sprint goal is still realistic and achievable. So let's now look at the broad top-level benefits of using Scrum. And when I'm referring to benefits here, I'm comparing what you would call the traditional plan-driven development that would carry on under a waterfall approach. Now, waterfall approaches, often called traditional project approaches or sequential, which they are, just like water running downhill, and they are predictive and they usually have prescriptive development processes. Quite the reverse then, since plan-driven processes attempt to plan for and anticipate up front all the features a user might want in the end product, and at that point determine how to build those features. If you've ever been involved in one of those projects, then you'll be familiar with the fairly common outcome partway through the project that the original requirements the user, in all honesty, thought they wanted. Now they're starting to see some of them. It's not what they want, or they want more, or they want different. That's just the nature of projects. So let's now look at these different benefits that we can gain from using a Scrum approach. First up, reduced costs, if you will, getting rid of dysfunction and waste. The reason this occurs in a traditional project, of course, is the cost of rework, managing changes, managing large risk because you've planned everything up front, versus Scrum, which delivers the project in small, short, focused sprints so that the development team are entirely focused on the sprint goal and converting the requirements from the product backlog into products and taking early feedback so that you can correct problems either technically or in terms of the process quickly and swiftly, thus reducing costs. The other benefit allied to that is improved return on investment, ROI. And this little diagram plays that out quite nicely. Let me just walk your eyes through it. Let's start off with a traditional project, shown here in blue. The project starts and the project budget is agreed. As a predictive project proceeds, it will continue gradually spending money, quite rightly, until at the end of the project, that's the trough at this point here, that time frame there, you actually ship the end product. And assuming this project will earn some form of revenue, and that's the benefits, then as that gradually happens, you repay back the investment in the project in the first place. Now this might be quite quickly, it might be quite slowly, whatever. They'll get a point, however, in time where you've paid back all the investment. From that moment on, the end product in its operational area will be giving benefits. Let's assume it's pure cost benefits. And now you'll start to make a profit. Okay? Now, with Scrum, as you've learned, we have sprints. And at the end of every sprint, and certainly at the end of every increment, there'll be a potentially shippable product. In other words, now looking at the green section here, again starting at the same time as Scrum project, that too will start to cost money as each increment gets done. But because you ship early, as soon as it's able to be put into operational use, you start to pay back the investment much earlier, and therefore you break even much earlier. And then, just like a traditional project, you're now into profit, as I've shown here. Because you do several increments, you can release early, and this gives you a huge improvement on return on investment. Another benefit is that you actually delight customers. Why? Because they get what they really want. As you'll learn, the product owner represents the users and customers, the stakeholders, if you will, and he or she is there represented in the Scrum team itself. Don't assume that the product owner is some manager role sitting outside. Not true at all. The product owner is intimately involved with the development team throughout the project. So he or she, if you will, is the voice of the customer. In this way, the customers get, as I've said here, what they really want versus what they thought they needed at the beginning, and as they change their minds, but the project isn't listening. Get the point? Another Scrum benefit is fast results. Why? Because the list of requirements are prioritized and form the backlog. The normal way in which requirements are represented on Scrum is something called user stories. Don't worry about that for now, we'll get into that later. Merely know that a user story is a certain way of representing the requirement from a user perspective. So, since the user stories or requirements are prioritized in the product backlog, What do we do with the backlog? We work on the most important and valuable requirements first. So the customer gets early delivery of the most valuable features for them. Not only does that improve return on investment from the supply side, it vastly increases customer satisfaction from the user or customer side. Another Scrum benefit is more fun and joy. Yes, it sounds a little bit cute, doesn't it? But it's been proven because of the self-empowered and high-energy nature of the Scrum team working in partnership with the product owner and the Scrum Master. Working on Scrum projects are a lot more fun. They get away from the traditional project where the project manager uses a command and control approach and gives out work to the team who then need to complete it against an agreed time frame. And of course, the biggest Scrum benefit of all is, as you've seen in Module 1, you get the success and the confidence of being able to deliver projects in a complex world. By complex, we mean, of course, are projects that need an adaptive approach rather than planning it all up front. Take, for example, a project which is to build a new office block in a city centre. The construction industry has been around for a long time, a lot longer than creating software or IT projects, and using the waterfall or prescriptive approach is the best way of delivering such projects. For example, you wouldn't want a Scrum team in the 53rd Scrum deciding to redesign the basement when you're already working on floor 10, if you see my point. So just to finish off this short module, let me just take you back to the Scrum framework again, if I may. So I've talked about requirements. We all know what those are. And in a traditional project, those will be gathered in often in a requirements document. There'll be a lot of time and effort and care gone into reflecting that the requirements are exactly what the customer is asking for, at least at the start of the project, that is. And these requirements, normally turned into user stories with Scrum, but let's keep calling them requirements for now, form what's known as the product backlog. Now, as you know, Scrum allows you to adapt quickly to changing market forces. Those are external forces, or regulations, or new innovations, or technological constraints. The list goes on. Also, of course, Scrum allows you to adapt quickly as you make some form of progress in your project, and you learn from that so that you can adapt quickly, getting regular and very early feedback. So we've got this prioritized product backlog with features. The early ones will be fine and detailed so that you could build 1 or 2 or 3 or more features in the form of sprints within an increment. As you go further down the list, these features out here, although not shown, will be very much larger features, often called epics, which we'll touch on later, where they're broad brush and not much detail is known. You'll come across a term called product backlog grooming. What this means, of course, is taking this prioritized backlog and doing all the things you might imagine, reprioritizing them, adding more details to later features, inserting new features, and so on and so forth. So the requirements forming the product backlog should be seen as a ruthlessly ordered to-do list. Now, we need to take off the most important product backlog features to create the sprint backlog. And here's where we carry out sprint planning. Not shown on my diagram here, but it not only includes agreeing what features should be used, but that's not enough, is it? Let's imagine each of these green things are features. You'd want to know what's involved in creating those features. In other words, the activities to be carried out with the sprint. So as part of sprint planning, you identify the activities, and then you might find yourself going back and swapping out some features as a result of the activities needed to carry out within the sprint. Ultimately, what we're looking for, remember that a sprint is a time box, anywhere typically between 1 week and 1 calendar month in duration, and you have to choose the number of features that can be done within that sprint. What happens now, of course, once that's approved, is that you can start the sprint itself. As I've said, anywhere typically between 1 and 4 weeks, and every day you have what's called the daily stand-up or the daily scrum. Stand up simply because it's normally done for 15 minutes standing up. The whole point is we don't turn this into a distracted meeting. It's merely, here's what I did yesterday, here's what I plan to do today, and here's any impediments or problems that I've got to cover or to get help from you folks. And at that daily scrum, the product owner will be running it, of course. It's not a status meeting. It's merely to make sure we've got what we need to continue running the scrum in the most efficient and effective manner. At the end of the sprint, you'll have what is called a potentially shippable product increment. A product increment, if you go back to the definition of incremental, is merely a part of the whole product. Even sculptors do this, and they've been using Scrum for hundreds of years without even knowing it. They start off by chipping a rough outline, perhaps the shape of a head if you're going to make a bust of some famous person, and then from that you gradually add the more detailed features. Well, each of those iterations of a sculpture would be called an increment, if you will. So the sprint review is where you would demonstrate a partly working prototype or a demonstration or what have you, as well as to update what it is we're creating. More of the sprint review later. There's one other meeting, of course, and it's called the sprint retrospective. What we're doing here is looking back on the sprint as a whole and the process involved, and this might include tools, individuals, any techniques we used and so on, and improving them and refining them, ready for the next sprint. So the sprint retrospective would look back at the features that we used, the features that are remaining, and so on. And what that does, it now allows us to go through for the next sprint, where the product owner would take the next set of requirements, create the ruthlessly ordered backlog, and the cycle continues. So if you remember the key words here, that's a good job done. These are the artifacts and the steps involved in a typical Scrum project. Very good. That's a good place to stop. So thank you for your time and attention. Let's you and I meet up again in the next module, Module 3, where I'll be looking at the life cycle of Scrum, and I'll introduce this thing that is called extended Scrum. And you can see how that works with the pure Scrum, if you will. So from me, Dave, I look forward to your company again in Module 3. Bye for now.